Thanks for joining. We're just going to give everyone another minute to dial in before we get started, so sit tight. Hello, and thanks for joining. My name is Cassie Rowe, Content Marketing Specialist at 451 Research. Today's webinar, The Future of Work, Liquid Enterprise, Work Ops, and Workforce Intelligence, will be presented by Chris Marsh, Research Director here at 451, and Rosanna Jimenez, who is a Senior Research Associate here at 451. Before we dive into the content, I just want to give a brief introduction to 451 Research for those of you who aren't familiar with us. 451 Research is a top-tier research and advisory firm headquartered in New York City. Our team of more than 100 analysts cover more than 2,000 technology vendors and service providers every year. 451 Research provides unique insight into emerging disruptive technologies.
Okay, so I think this is Chris Marsh. I think Cassie maybe just got cut off at the start there during her introduction. So let me kick it off. I think one of the things she was going to say was, there is a chance for Q&A during the presentation, so feel free to submit questions as we go through, and we should have some time at the end to address those before we end the webcast. So. Welcome everybody to the webcast. First of all, just a little bit more on my team and sort of where these perspectives are coming from. I lead a group of analysts essentially looking at productivity software. So we address the work management space, the content management space, collaboration and communications tools. We look at asset creation technologies and digital workspaces. So day in, day out, we're looking at innovation in each of these areas and, where it's happening from outside and sort of changing the direction of the overall productivity category. It's one of our fundamental beliefs that the most interesting innovation and the sort of overall direction, if you like, of software in this space is emerging more interestingly from intersections across those different segment areas, and then infused by things like AI and ML and IoT from outside, than innovations that are happening inside any one of the particular segments. So that describes sort of our view of where innovation is coming from. Significant disruption we see of the status quo when it comes to workforce tooling, and it's happening at a pace that has left us without the language to describe modern work, let alone the future of work that's coming down the track. So, I'll be sharing some of our concepts and language that we use that we think encapsulates what's going on, and you can see some of these on the title slide. So I'll be giving a point of view as to what we think the liquid enterprise represents. Really, it's the kind of digital native business we think will win in the future of the digital age. I'm going to be talking about how we think work ops describes how work will happen in this future. And I'll also be showing some perspectives on how we think we're seeing early indicators of a new type of sort of product archetype that we term the workforce intelligence platform. And we see that really inhabiting the white space left by the disruption of traditional sort of workforce tooling segments. So this is going to be quite macro, it's going to be quite forward-looking, and really it's designed to help us think about what's coming down the road and how we can sort of understand it and describe it. So without further ado, in terms of agenda, pretty straightforward. We're going to start by looking at what we think is preventing and what we think is driving productivity in the workforce. And then we're going to talk about why we think WorkOps is the kind of future pattern that we think will come to determine how, more of the work that we do, how that looks. And then finally, we're going to give some perspectives on, employee engagement and what all of this means for how a company needs to think about engaging its employees throughout work execution. So, first of all, what are the kind of macro trends driving the transformation of the workforce? The background to so much of the innovation in the workplace that we see is the sort of techno empowerment of individuals in their personal lives, right? So consumerization of IT, I guess, is one way that that's been framed. Mobile, wearable, other types of device, combining with social media, cloud-based services and applications, advances in data analytics that are making digital experiences more personalized. All of these things over the past, decade or so have really, begun to revolutionize how we think about, things that we experience, how we understand things, how we relate to one another, and how we relate to the environment around us. So it's really kind of causing us to rethink our own sort of cognition, if you like. As that happens, those innovations that we've sort of primarily seen in the consumer space, inevitably gradually work their way into workforce technologies. So, more remote and mobile working, it's changing the way we collaborate. The mass customization of work through things like workflow and intelligent business process design is more of a reality now than it's ever been before. And then at the same time, we have the rise in the gig economy and the sharing and maker movements that are sort of, birthing whole new economies, right? New types of value exchange, new technology platforms, serving interactions that are happening in that kind of semi-formal economy. All of this is impacting labor market productivity and employment regulations. And this is causing societies to think about, education. How do we skill people for the workforce? How do we view work? How do we value work? So, lots of big macro forces that are sort of, the background context to how, we need to think about productivity and what those tools that enable that productivity need to be. I think what unites across all of these things is the kind of growing importance of the context of data that runs through these digital experiences. We want more personalization. That's beginning to, occur within expectations in the workforce. And that's transferring agency to individuals and to smaller groups away from sort of organizations and institutions. And I think probably more than anything, that transfer of agents is the single biggest disruptor to workforce technologies. It's at the root of most of the really promising innovation that we see. It's the backdrop to how we need to think about engaging employees, and obviously the link between engaged employees and sort of improved business outcomes. So those sort of contextual experiences are, for us as a research firm, so important that they actually form one of the four macro themes that we use to describe the future of enterprise technology. So alongside pervasive intelligence, invisible infrastructure, and universal risk. So if you want to find out more about Foresight, which is really kind of our view on the future of enterprise technology, take a look at our website. We've got some really interesting materials to have a look at that gives that overall kind of macro view across enterprise technology. So, we're beginning to see that kind of transfer of agency, tools beginning to enable that, technologies allowing for much greater flexibility in how we design work, more transparency across work execution, more agility, All of those things are happening. We see signs of companies adopting technologies and gaining those benefits. The reality, though, for most businesses is that friction across work is entirely pervasive still, right? So we have, basic things like companies struggling with how to do search across their content and their data and their information. Silos everywhere when it comes to technology. In terms of content repositories alone, a large enterprise may have hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of repositories. So, lots of silos. Search is very difficult. I think just a general lack of automation in tooling. And, even amongst some of the more kind of modern SaaS applications, usability, isn't wholly improved from where we were sort of pre-SaaS. And, difficulties that we hear through research of companies trying to generate and leverage metadata so that they can do things like, report against a portfolio of work or, construct a workflow that maybe spans a number of different types of application. Obviously, a lot of that technology friction results in productivity friction, right? So silos of content, silos of people, lots of replication of manual things needing to be done. Obviously, a lot of that ends up in manual error, dead ends where companies are trying to stitch together applications into workflows where they weren't really designed to do that. And, a just growing propensity against certainly younger members of the workforce to reject tooling that they're provided, if they're not giving them the experience that they're looking for to get their work done. So, that obviously ends up in a lot of issues with execution, disjointed collaboration, processes that aren't differentiated, right? So sort of internal process IP that isn't really differentiated from what maybe your competition is doing. Fragmented reporting, no kind of single source of truth for reporting, weak governance, and of course, what we're all going to be familiar with, the constant kind of context switching between all the different types of applications that give us, some snapshots into different areas of how we do work. And all of those things really sum up into what we call strategic debt, which is the sort of lag between, the degree to which a company's target market conditions and or user requirements change, and the company's ability to deliver to those. So, what we're describing here isn't a worst-case scenario. It seems pretty glum. Unfortunately, it's the common reality for most businesses. And I think it shows just how accepting of dysfunctional work and workforce technologies businesses have had to be over time. And I think this is why we see that we're approaching a kind of shakeout, because we, on the flip side to that, see the pace of innovation in productivity software really accelerating, just as many companies realize they need these new ways to get work done. So this is going to be existential for, both the vendors and for enterprises who don't adjust, to take account of this shift, because those that do will be on an entirely different trajectory. So, what this means is that there's no real incumbent for effective modern work, right? We speak to all manner of vendors in 451, lots of startups, lots of kind of mid-sized companies, lots of the bigger sort of mega cap, long-standing incumbent technology providers. And everyone we speak to is aware quite how much the ground is shifting, unlike ever before. There is no one suite, there is no magic bullet that give businesses what they need. And that's as true for workforce tooling and productivity software as it is, I think, probably for almost any category of enterprise technology. There are, though, lots of really sort of promising signs of how technologies are evolving to underpin, much more effective work, contextual, sort of transversal, seamless, and engaging work. So what are some of those signs that we're seeing that promise a kind of brighter future? So these are just some of the kind of technology trends we see that have a particular influence on the shape of productivity software. I think, first of all, and just as a matter of fact, the overall application estate we think will continue to grow. It will be catalyzed by SaaS, continuing to be catalyzed by SaaS, the continued growth in prosumer apps, and new platforms serving those kinds of alternative work arrangements that I alluded to before. I think we are seeing, things like intelligence and growing connectivity around applications and automation within application experiences improve overall usability, right? So we're gradually seeing application design allowing more of a focus on higher value kinds of work and less of the kind of lower value manual sort of work that's traditionally had to be done. We're seeing really strong growth in the workflow automation and hybrid integration markets, and that's fueling, more work being done across apps as opposed to within singular apps or suites. And, that tied to the first bullet point explain, I think, much of how we think about the future of work. If the overall number of applications is going to grow, then, there's going to need to be ways to construct workflows that are transversal to those applications and that overall application estate. I think one of the things we also see is, both vendors and enterprises trying to figure out how collaboration can be more kind of interstitial within the context of more structured work, rather than being that place where people sort of surface out to just have a conversation or to message or communicate with someone. So collaboration embedded within the context of work. Google, Microsoft, and others we see working on sort of new ways of doing highly scalable search across information and data. Google previewed, I think, what they call enterprise search at their next conference a couple of months ago. Pretty interesting. Much more focus on rich metadata, self-service analytics, and things like machine learning to support much more continuous visibility over the life cycle of work. We also see companies begin to leverage some of those technologies and approaches to model work scenarios so they can try and be a bit more predictive in terms of how work ends up in some kind of business outcome. We also see just more intelligence and also more understanding of the interdependencies between the different work nodes, right? Whether that's a person or a team, whether that's a piece of content or data or information kept somewhere. It could also be a set of strategic objectives or some kind of goals across work delivery. And I think that sort of growing understanding of interdependencies across those work nodes is supporting much more highly flexible resource management in and out of work streams. And then finally, another really interesting trend that we see that we're putting a lot of focus on at the moment in terms of our research is the emergence of more visual and collaborative and kind of live content services that are disruptive to a lot of the traditional ways in the sort of big productivity suites of how we generate and leverage content. So, work is becoming more connected, more intelligent. There are more avenues to make unstructured work effectively structured. I think work is generally atomizing and becoming more manipulable, or rather the nodes across work are becoming more manipulable. So, that atomization is ultimately behind why a lot of the fast growth in the productivity space that we see is amongst tooling that is adopted from the bottoms up, right, from the grassroots, if you like, tools that sort of go into a business environment and then sort of land and expand and spread across the workforce into different teams and divisions. So, it's really important, I think, to understand what's going on here. One of the implications is that, budgets and power are leaking out of traditional centers, whether they're IT or some kind of PMO or some kind of centralized team of process specialists. Vendors are figuring out how to leverage, greater connectedness and intelligence and context to bring more people, data, and workflow into their tools. And that means product value is changing to satisfy the need to have those closest to specific work responsible for designing and overseeing and executing it. So, traditionally we think of the tooling market as a sort of pyramid. You get the most strategic kind of tools on top, maybe like a BPM or a traditional system of record. You get sort of generic tools on the bottom, and then everything in between. I think one of the things that we see is that value is essentially sort of inverting, so that a lot of the tactical kinds of work that are being done by tools that go in at the grassroots are actually becoming more strategic, right? We talk about in our research a sort of tactical mesh of workflow summing up into a strategic set of operations. And that very much suits the way companies want to increasingly do work, right? Looser, more matrixed, more decentralized and collaborative forms of organization. And this is obviously very disruptive to vendors kind of formally topping the pyramid, raising questions as to whether their architectures can kind of scale downward and then horizontally, and vice versa for those looking to sell kind of enterprise-wide deployments. So based on those technology trends, I think we can make a few sensible assumptions. Ownership over the full life cycle of work execution, including of more complex types of work, will continue to decentralize, so away from those centralized teams where traditionally those tools have been owned and bought and work designed from. The overall speed of work execution, we think, will increase. We think it will become more flexible, more contextually intelligent, and more open-ended, right? So less work has a sort of finite beginning and end, and more work will be open-ended and fluid. So WorkOps is the umbrella term that we use to describe that future. So how business goals and workforce execution come together in a much more highly responsive way than has kind of heretofore been achievable. So, if you just look at the diagram, I mean, the sort of figure of 8 itself should say a little bit about how we think about this. So again, less work is sort of finite beginning and end. We have workflows that can, intersect throughout and across different work streams or portfolios of work. Visibility available as work happens, and the ability to report leveraging metadata against work at any stage of the life cycle. More collaboration embedded within the flow of within the flow of a work stream. The direction of the workflow being able to be sort of directionally triggered dependent on context, and then the ability to sort of insert resources flexibly into work streams depending on requirements. So, obviously the way we conceive of WorkOps is similar, and there's obviously a parallel to DevOps, right? So in the DevOps world, you're looking to create more flexible and dependable development cycles by having sort of automation and monitoring across that life cycle. The way we think about WorkOps is that you're enabling much more responsive work execution by having intelligent context, workflow automation, collaboration, and reporting embedded across the life cycle. So, part of the reason why we originated the term WorkOps was because, none of the existing ways of talking about and labeling work actually described, the kinds of work that are now being enabled by those trends that we articulated earlier. There is such a variation of work, right? If you think about the totality of work in a company, different roles, different people, different departments, different companies, different types of industry, different initiatives, programs, projects that happen within the total remit of the work a company needs to execute against. So, not all of that is going to, by any means, be described by, project management and or by, agile and lean, which, haven't really sort of broken out of the development world as ways to describe how work is done. So WorkOps to us is, the way we think about how that massive work across an organization will be conducted. So, less formally sequential than project management. Objectives and requirements are conceived outside of that finite start and end. Much more tools to be open to change and adaptation. Directionally also different from traditional kind of project-style PMO-centric work in the sense that WorkOps is all about decentralized or tooling the decentralization of work outside of centralized teams, right? So again, rather than finite projects, more work scenarios operationalized, visibility and learnings across the life cycle. That feeds continuous execution of what becomes essentially sort of ongoing, repeating, dovetailing work streams. We think WorkOps is so different from project management. We think it's not really suited to describe very kind of creative types of work. So, one of the implications really of how we think about work ops is that all the nodes across an organization, whether they're, physical or human or digital, essentially become programmable. And the goal is to infuse as much intelligence and automation around those nodes as possible. So, where there's work for whom its sort of key value is its very unstructured, very creative nature, so sort of creatively ideating or sort of brainstorming, WorkOps doesn't really describe that kind of world. We do conceive of it as kind of similar to Agile and Lean in that the focus is on sort of continuously learning. You're optimizing a system of delivery, and in this sense, it's just of work rather than of software. Those doing the work are best placed to decide how it's done. The focus is on responding quickly to changes rather than just sort of seeing out some agreed upon plan. So, similar to Agile in those regards. Obviously different, though, with regard to having a much broader lens on how an organization executes across a spectrum of work scenarios. So, some of how we think about it is, WorkOps is Agile for modern work beyond software engineering. So, there's a little bit more granularity in terms of how we think about WorkOps. We tend to break it down in terms of sort of WorkOps, TeamOps, and SoloOps. So TeamOps is where, local teams are taking advantage of some of these tooling, some of these technology trends to really have the freedom to design and create new work processes at the local level that will unlock new ways of organizing resources across the company. And then SoloOps is how we think about the individual productivity element to this, right? So how as an individual employee in a workforce, what you can gain from these emergent capabilities. And, crucially, I think one of the implications is that more work will pass outside of formal reporting hierarchies and into more sort of organic, self-organizing communities of people that organize around specific initiatives or types of work or projects. So, that kind of flexibility as nodes, including people, tessellate much more easily to execute work, we think will be a key characteristic of every enterprise's future digital competitiveness. So, the ops suffix in WorkOps obviously derives from the growing need for speed in work execution, and we use it as a way to describe that, as well as the role of automation and purposeful collaboration in how those things are delivered. So, WorkOps, the new kind of methodology shaping digital competitiveness, heavily grounded in the local agility provided by TeamOps and the creative potential from SoloOps, is how we think about the emerging future for work. So, one of the outcomes of technologies that are enabling WorkOps practices will be the emergence of what we call the liquid enterprise. So, WorkOps satisfies a future where businesses can much more fluidly manage their resources, much more easily define and redefine their workflows and their processes, and hence their operations based on those processes. Companies much more able to, based on those things, responsively address changes in their target markets and or their users' requirements in those markets. And that inevitably requires balancing the local agility of business teams with centralized oversight, right? So you're empowering teams with the ability to create those new work processes, but you're also guardrailing them to ensure that you have the right kind of governance and compliance. So, just some of the things that we're beginning to hear when we speak to enterprises that we believe supports this view that companies are looking to be much more liquid in terms of how they manage their resources, in terms of how they tessellate those resources. We see some companies using workflow automation platforms whereby they have hundreds of different workflows developed not by sort of business process specialists, but by business users, and that is a very significant change. And they're becoming, very flexible arteries for how, different types of, tactical to strategic work is getting done. We see plenty of examples, obviously, on the customer-facing side, right? Companies embracing intelligent apps that embed things like machine learning for customer experience improvements, reducing friction points, improving automation, generating sort of intelligent recommendations to customers. We had some interesting conversations actually recently with some of our enterprise clients about internal job markets where they're looking to much more flexibly sort of discover, evaluate and assign internal skill sets from different members of their employees to new work initiatives when they come up, so that somebody can be sort of inserted into that initiative and then back out into their sort of day job when they're no longer needed to be part of that work delivery. So, it's our belief that whereas, companies providing kind of massively scalable and efficient infrastructures and then, easy kind of UI on the front, so think of like Airbnbs and Ubers, we kind of laud those companies now as digital leaders. It's our view that in the future, it's going to be the kind of liquid enterprise that we'll really look to as a kind of digital leader. Companies that can really fluidly manage their resources, organize highly responsively around the conditions they need to satisfy. And, I think one of the really important advantages that the liquid enterprise will have is that internal business process IP will ultimately be opaque to outside competition, right? If as a company you're leveraging new types of, for example, workflow automation tooling, it's very difficult for your competition outside in your sort of competitive landscape to actually understand and have visibility into how you've constructed your workflows. So I think that's going to be one of the big advantages of the liquid enterprise in the future. So, just as a kind of recap and thinking a little bit more about, what this means for the technology landscape, new agile work ops practices, more seamless types of workflow, more rapid responsive types of local execution. It's our view that this makes current productivity software segments vulnerable. In fact, it makes all current productivity software segments vulnerable. The way we see it is, a little bit like the tortoise and the hare. The hare races off, the tortoise is kind of left in its tracks. The hare slows down, the tortoise catches up and wins in the end. We kind of use that as a metaphor to describe the sort of emergence of the best of breed narrative that we've seen with the rise of new SaaS incumbents, right? They're pushing this best of breed narrative. The implication being that a few winners in separate product categories will emerge. They'll play nicely with one another through connectors and APIs, and that will serve the kind of future need when it comes to enterprise IT. We actually think that's very premature. Best of breed when it comes to SaaS in the productivity space has been pretty much the path of least resistance for the most part. There have been better ways of doing something everybody already understands, right? Better way to manage content, better way to collaborate, better way to access, to provide access to applications. Most productivity segments, most vendors really only satisfy one main archetype for work and typically focus on one specific kind of constituency, either team-based or divisional-based or company-wide in a specific kind of way. So, the opportunity for best-of-breed SaaS vendors to disrupt within their own segment and drive market share, I think has really downplayed the need to think about how to address work requirements, beyond the segment sort of boundaries. Again, going back to one of my original points of view, productivity software we think is evolving at least as much from intersections across segments and catalyzed by big new trends like AI and ML from outside as it is within each. And therefore that's, despite the sort of best of breed narrative, I think actually makes all segments vulnerable in this sort of time of disruption. So, as work moves out of sort of technology and organizational silos, becomes more cross-divisional, more cross-disciplinary, we think that's opening up new white space for tooling. And, we describe that white space as being inhabited by what we think will be a new software archetype in the productivity arena that we term the workforce intelligence platform. Right. So, if you think about the two axes on this diagram, most tooling have either gone broad or they've gone deep, right? So, the white space that we see the WIP inhabiting is essentially optimizing on both of those axes, being able within a platform to address a real breadth of different types of work scenario, but also allow how they're designed and managed and executed against, with a high degree of sophistication. And most tooling is really only traded off, one for the other, typically. It's really interesting, though, when we speak to different vendors within different segments, quite how much they actually see that white space as an opportunity they're tacking towards, if you like. So if you speak to, for example, BPM vendors who are trying to move down the stack, investing in low, no-code, process mining, RPA. If you look at modern work management vendors, they're pitching kind of interesting new visions as organization-wide systems of work. Even when you speak to kind of traditional digital workspaces, they're talking much less these days about the main value prop being a secure sort of perimeter that people can authenticate through to access their applications. They're talking much more about, smart, intelligent workspaces where people have the ability to do things like transversal workflow across the applications that are contained in that workspace. So, the emergence of WIP-style platforms will heavily require the leveraging of more intelligence. Indeed, we're seeing an ever-growing list of vendors, both large and small, beginning to infuse AI into their tooling. So, Rosanna, let me sort of hand over to you. Why don't you take us through some of the main use cases that you see where AI is beginning to play a bigger role in productivity software?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So, as Chris mentioned, I'll be discussing a few use cases of AI in the productivity landscape. A few examples here. NLP, or natural language processing. It's been around since the 50s and the Turing test, but with the somewhat recent advent of machine learning methods, it has become more accurate and useful. And we're seeing vendors who are providing AI-powered NLP for workforce productivity. And those include vendors like Cohere and Aizimov. Cohere, for example, finds and acts on the knowledge embedded in natural text from databases, documents, and websites, basically trying to eliminate the human effort it takes to fill out things like forms, send emails, trigger requests. Aizimov, they use NLP basically to specialize in personalized email and text automation, generally for sales initiatives. Another example is in software robotics, or more specifically robotic process automation. It's another technology that's being applied to power AI based on process acceleration. So it's one of the more visible players in this area that we've covered is Software AG. So the company's WebMethods robotic process automation solution runs along top of an organization's existing systems process and allows for administrators to set automatic rule-based tasks for the purpose of accelerating processes and reducing costs. Another use case of AI and productivity that we're seeing, as many of you may know from your own experiences, collaborative messaging platforms have in many ways made meetings even more important with tools such as Slack, Fuse, Zoom. They've been helping remove some of those less vital meetings that involve document sharing. And although they're helpful, the successful planning and execution of meetings is still very much necessary. And so what we're seeing are some vendors who are using AI to make meetings more intelligent, which means shorter and more productive interactions. One example is with meeting assistants. Voicera's Eva in Meeting AI Assistant listens into meetings, whether they're in person or on a conference call, and documents notes whether or not the user is in attendance. Some other vendors who are doing similar meeting assistant products is AiSense, Tetra, and VoiceFox. Meetings are also enhanced by better interactions, and for some workforces, this means having the ability to visualize information being shared, such as architectural or surgical meetings, that depend on detailed images to guide their work. So Medico is a smaller player in this space, offering its Meta2 development kit for these types of environments. And the third use case I'll be discussing is assisted decision making. And a successful workforce really does depend on the precise and timely decisions that workers make based on data that's generally contextual information. So it's not always easy to collect or interpret. And one example of this is in the hiring process within HR teams. So that involves creating the right job listings for the right candidates and using highly strategic one-on-one email exchanges for this type of recruitment. Some vendors in this space include Textio's Hire. Their product uses augmented writing to help workforce recruiters attract the right talent with its intelligent job description creator. Other companies using AI for assisted decision-making in the recruitment process space are Smashfly, Maya, and Paradox. And for workforces that rely on really interdependent tasks in order for other areas of the organization to perform their particular roles in the production scheme, all workers really must be highly strategic when prioritizing their pipelines. And to achieve this optimal, effective time management in a modern workplace, it's truly a challenge for the average human worker, as many of us may know. Some vendors like Replicon, Smarter Time, and Timely are offering tools that use AI to enhance worker time management. For example, Replicon's Time Intelligence platform processes time data signals and enables contextual analysis of how that time is used. So the information used to understand the relationships between the data sets train a rule-based predictive and prescriptive model, and that helps identify anomalies and then offers recommendations for how to best decide on what tasks should be done and when. Also, automated time tracking is another useful application for AI for productivity. Timely's Memory AI product eliminates the human error and time waste that generally goes into manual time tracking. And so we're already seeing AI's role in workforce productivity-specific technologies and do expect to see it only increase. Thank you, Chris.
Great, thanks, Rosanna. Really interesting examples there. So, AI and contextual intelligence and intelligence generally, obviously becoming really important to the evolution of the kind of productivity software space. I'm just going to spend a little moment talking about, some of the sort of different flavors of, new work destinations, if you like, that we see emerging from all of the trends that we've talked about. So, we see a lot in the sort of work management space, right? So Workfront talk about, having an operational system of record. There is no, if you think about it, system of work across an organization. In the same kind of space, you see Smartsheet talking about their work execution platform, and you see the likes of Asana talk about, basically giving a company like a GPS system. You tell it where you need to go, and it will sort of guide you there in an automated and intelligent kind of way. I thought it was really striking at Box's conference a couple of months ago, quite how much they were talking about, being and enabling the kind of digital workplace. Obviously, it was the sort of content-centric messaging around that, but it was maybe a sort of more overt kind of message about being that destination where people will get work done than we've heard from them in the past. Plenty of other examples here. Facebook and its workplace tooling. I think they see really Workplace as a hub to kind of unite all apps, if you like. Bring data, information, and interactions from other app applications into Workplace where they can be collaborated around. Slack trying to facilitate a sort of workspace notion, leveraging the integrations across its ecosystem of applications, and using things like its actions capability to enable more automation across those applications, and obviously with Slack being the kind of central hub. So lots of examples here of where companies are taking advantage of the level of disruption, of the kind of disaggregation of some of the traditional systems of record, and the opportunity to allow companies new ways to think about how to get their work done. So it's really our view that this kind of radically different future for work that we're seeing, because a lot of the new types of technology approach is really big enough for us to have to actually rethink the archetypes we use to understand and describe work. And again, I think that's been one of the challenges historically of how we think about this space. We tend to think about tools either satisfying a need to collaborate and or sort of create content, or integrate systems with one another, or manage work or manage data, or report on work. The pace of change that we're seeing, in our view, is actually changing those sort of functional archetypes that vendors are going to need to satisfy to drive adoption of their technology. And obviously, product messaging is going to need to change to adhere to that. So, where technology will increasingly be providing sort of abstraction and automation and prediction, human-centric work will be about leveraging those kind of technologies to ask more directional questions and having those modeled in the system to arrive at better outcomes. So if you take sort of content management, for example, traditional sort of messaging around content management at the moment typically focus on improving how to manage content, right? Residency, governance, security, things like that. How those same tools surface content automatically into workflows to satisfy specific business goals will obviously be an increasingly important message. And the questions that next generation tools answer will all need to be more business focused and less function focused. So, there's a lot of detail on this slide. I think we're providing the PDF of these slides afterwards, so don't feel the need to read it all now. But essentially, this represents where we think the sort of new archetypes will be. It's going to be much more about providing contextual experiences, providing more automation, more personalization, allowing the sort of continuous visibility into and visualization of work across the life cycle. And rather than just thinking about how to report on work, actually thinking about how to take those signals of how work is progressing and how to actually model work in a way where it can ultimately become predictive. So, we've talked a lot about, what we see as the kind of, early indicators of trends that are beginning to shape new kinds of capabilities. We've talked about how we think WorkOps is a good way to describe what those new technologies and approaches are beginning to enable, right? A future of much more kind of responsive, continuous work execution. We've talked a little bit just now about, some of the kind of new spins on what a destination for work are from different vendors across segments, where they're looking to leverage some of those trends. I just want to sort of finish by talking a little bit about what we think this all means for employee engagement. Now, one of the kind of key drivers of WorkOps and of that white space that we think the workforce intelligence platform sort of archetype will inhabit is the need to more closely tie together employee motivation with organizational execution. And actually, we have a sort of growing sort of cadence of inquiry that our customers are asking to do with us around what that sort of modern employee engagement narrative needs to be and how that ties into sort of improved business outcomes. A lot of the messaging in this space, I think, is pretty or is becoming old-fashioned, right? Lots of the mobile-centric kind of work anytime, anywhere, a lot of the network-centric sort of connected workplaces, a lot of the sort of HR-centric talk around employee engagement is actually pretty narrow. It focuses on, sort of compensation benefits, but increasingly around sort of, corporate mission statements and how important it is for, there to be the kind of mission statement that a workforce and employee base would align with. I think for us, a lot of that just feels quite old-fashioned, and actually what increasingly is missing, especially given all of these trends that we've talked about, is more of a focus on employee-driven work execution culture, right? So we have a number of different ways to talk about, what that means and how tooling needs to evolve to satisfy what we call, as per this slide, this hierarchy of employee motivation. So, productivity tools have traditionally downplayed the kind of softer benefits of, all those kind of things that consumer applications have done very well, right? Purposeful social connectedness, rather than just kind of messaging and collaboration. Play-based learning is becoming a much bigger thing within the workforce. Right, play in the sense of work being done is much more about intrinsic motivation to actually get work done. Self-mastery, sort of excitement and spontaneity. So all of these things that the consumer realm has done very well at are beginning to pervade the workforce space as well. Again, lots of detail on the slide. You'll be able to see in the PDF afterwards. But this is one of the ways we think about employee engagement. Currently, most tooling only really satisfies that bottom level, right? Sort of having people be interested in using your tool. Increasingly, we see tooling evolving to satisfy deeper levels of engagement, allowing more types of creativity, and not just sort of like ideation style creativity, but if you decentralize the ability to create workflow, and you do that in a way where you're not required to have technical skills in order to design that workflow, you are then enabling a creative pursuit, right? People can use those kinds of capabilities to think about different ways to actually design work. And then the further you go up the hierarchy, the more you're satisfying the workforce's need to aspire to, sort of self-improvement and self-mastery. So learning and development are going to become a much more important constituent of the employee experience. One of the other ways that we use to talk about employee engagement is via this sort of what we call the 4 pillars of the employee experience. So, if on the previous slide, we were talking about how, there are unserved needs within employees that tooling is slowly evolving to satisfy. What, in a more functional, pragmatic sense, is that tooling looking to achieve, or what does it need to achieve? So this is the kind of way that we think about it. You're right. The first one being enthuse, right? So giving more spontaneity, more contextuality into work, connecting people, but not just people, contextually correlating and connecting people with different types of asset needed to optimally execute their work, right? So that could be anything from colleagues to customers to prospects to partners to suppliers to candidates. It's about connecting all of those things where relevant with the right type of content, the right kind of data, the right kind of insight and knowledge that exists within the business. The third pillar is how we talk about support, right? And this talks a little bit to some of those use cases Rosanna was talking about, leveraging things like AI to provide, much intelligent and automated actions, having workflows and processes designed in a way to reduce the low-value manual work that everybody's finding themselves having to do as they go in and out of different tools and have all those context-switching problems. So this is things like, intelligent recommendations, very much something we obviously see in the customer world, sort of customer experience world, but increasingly being thought about as how you can enable that within the workforce experience. It's about, automated transcription of meeting notes, for example, and different ways to provide troubleshooting and, automated scheduling, for example. And then the final pillar is what we call represent, which is really where we see a big role for things like virtual personal assistants, right? Having technology actually help you curate your own work experience. So, these are just some of the ways that we think are going to shape what that sort of next generation employee engagement model is going to look like in a way traditionally where, these things haven't been possible with existing technologies. So just by means of conclusion, we rather than just giving, I guess, a series of recommendations, I thought I would just touch on some of those broad themes that we've talked about that we think are beginning to give shape to what the future of work looks like. Right. So the context economy is how we, at the start of the presentation, talked about the growing importance of contextual experiences. This is the battleground really for businesses in the digital age. To provide that context, you really need the data. And that's the backdrop for a lot of the conversations we have with vendors in the productivity software space. They're all trying to get more people and more data onto their platform in order to provide those kind of more contextual, intelligent, personalized workforce experiences. The liquid enterprise will be the businesses that we think will win in the digital age, those that are very able to highly flexibly manage their different resources to respond to their market requirements. WorkOps, we think, will be the engine of the liquid enterprise, right? It's the, different work behaviors, work patterns, work practices that are beginning to be enabled by the sort of atomization of work and the decentralization of some of the capabilities, allowing that kind of local execution. That's going to drive the overall sort of enterprise responsiveness. The importance of the self-actualizing worker, right? So going back to the past couple of slides, it's not just about, having someone in a reporting hierarchy. You give them the tools, you expect them to be able to get their work done. It's about satisfying higher order needs amongst individuals in the workplace. And then finally, a lot of what this is creating are new types of value, right? The way we think about work, what we want from our work experience, maybe the degree to which we both work in the formal economy, but maybe also the semi-formal economy. So this is creating new types of value exchange and new types of currency for productivity. And one of those things that we see becoming increasingly important is just recognition, right? So having the ability in tooling to recognize someone's contribution, have that play a more important part in terms of how you facilitate someone's progression through their career. So new types of value that people are looking for, and that tools are beginning to be able to satisfy. So that was a lot of thoughts, a lot of perspectives. Again, I think you'll be able to pull the PDF after this presentation if you want to look into those in a little bit more detail. Obviously, feel free to reach out to us if you'd like a conversation around what we think this means in terms of the particular challenges you have, in terms of facilitating work. I think we're pretty much at the top of the time, so I'll just give, before I hand back over to Cassie, a final thank you for dialing into the webinar. It's been a pleasure for Rosanna and I to share some of our points of view on how we think the future of work is unfurling. Cassie, back to you.
Thank you, Chris and Rosanna, and thank you for this excellent presentation. As Chris did mention, and sorry, I did get cut off at the beginning of the webinar, so I didn't get to share this with you. The slides are actually available in the attachment and links section of your BrightTalk platform, which you can download at any time. We'd also appreciate if you could leave us some feedback. Just let us know how we're doing, if there's anything that you particularly liked, where you think we can improve. Anything like that makes our webinars better. We didn't quite get a chance to have a Q&A since we are almost at the top of the hour. However, as Chris mentioned, feel free to reach out and we'll be happy to address questions at any time. Any final thoughts, Chris and Rosanna?
I think we're good. Just thanks again for everyone to participate, and look forward to ongoing conversations around the future of work.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.